Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the only podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. Your host, Roberto Mazza, will bring you guests discussing their relationship with the Holy City. A journey through history, society, feelings, and hopes for the future. Follow the podcast on all social media platforms at Jerusalem Unplugged.
Welcome to Jerusalem Unplugged, the podcast dedicated to Jerusalem, its history, and its people. I'm your host, Roberto Mazza, and today it's with great pleasure that my guest is Fadi Boukaram. Maybe you've never heard of him, or maybe you're already a follower of Fadi. Fadi has a brilliant account on all social media, Sidras that I will post also via podcast notes. And essentially, Fadi is very much interested in providing sort of the history of certain words, of historical cultural facts that have to do mostly with the Middle East. But we should say that Fadi is a Dublin-based Lebanese, formerly a photographer, and now, working on his future. So, first of all, Fadi, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So, I want to introduce yourself first to all of the listeners, and I know for a fact that some of the listeners are already subscribing to your reels. But can you tell us something about yourself, about your trips? I know you spent some time in America. And also, how did you start this Sidros K account? And why working on words and on the etymology and the history of these words?
Sure. Thank you for that. So, as a background, I was born and raised in Lebanon, spent most of my life there. But then in 2005, I went to the U.S. to get my graduate degree. My background is I'm an engineer, but I got a degree in finance over there. And then in 2016, when I was in Baghdad, I had a bit of an incident there, and I decided to take a break from work. So I left and went to the U.S., got me an RV, which is a camper, and just spent 6 months on the road in my RV, touring all the towns called Lebanon in the US, and there's 47 of them. So I wanted to photograph them, meet the people, and all that. And initially, I had thought it was just going to be, what do you call that? It's kind of like a bit of a tourism thing, to be honest. But it just happened to be during the election season in 2016. So it unexpectedly became a chance for me to meet people from all over the US and, talk to them about their hopes, their dreams, their fears, everything about that. So just out of interest. And then in 2018, I went for a second trip because I wanted to plant cedar trees. And the reason I had to go and plant cedar trees is related to Jerusalem, by the way. So, I'll tell you a little bit about that. So I went on a second trip, also about 5-6 months, planted 11 or 12 trees, I forgot, in some of these towns where the weather permits. Then I got a job offer in Dublin. I moved here. And then during the pandemic, I was stuck at home like everyone. And I thought, what if I make videos on words? Because this is something that interests me. And it's kind of like, why are words related across separate languages? So it was my first time doing anything like that, doing videos. So I posted on TikTok. Then I started this maybe a couple of months ago. I started uploading on Instagram. And I'm just happy that a lot of people are also interested in the commonalities that we have in the words that we say. So that's about it.
I was curious about something. You're sitting in Ireland, which is a country
Yes.
I lived in for a few years. I never learned any Irish other than a few words here and there. And I was wondering, in terms of the language, how was your experience of Irish, not necessarily the language, but also the Irish accent and for someone coming from so different places around the world, particularly Lebanon and Iraq, sitting in Dublin?
Well, I can tell you something about the language right away, in that I wanted to learn Irish. So the Gaelic language, part of the Gaelic families. And maybe it took me a week just to see what's going on. And it was kind of like one of the most shocking things for me. Why is that? Because I do speak a few languages. I had to learn French in school for 12 years. I also speak English and all that. So I'm familiar with the European languages, being what we call SVO languages, subject, verb, object, right? So the only languages I know that are VSO, verb, subject, object, is Arabic, of course, and the other Semitic languages like Aramaic and Hebrew. And then you move to Ireland, and it's like, how is that language structured the same way as a Semitic language? It's the sentence structure, the preposition, how there's agglutination and suffix. So that blew my mind. And then I went into trying to read the history of it, and there are theories saying that there is a Semitic substrate, or was it a superstrate? I forgot, into the Gaelic languages or some of the Celtic languages. And some of them, well, there is one linguist, Theo Veneman, who calls the branch Semitic languages. So he calls Celtic Semitic languages due to the influence. I don't know, like there's no consensus, of course, like it's a bit of a fringe maybe, but still to me, it's kind of like, oh my God, this is kind of like learning Arabic with different words about the Irish language.
That's fascinating. But because you mentioned that you study French, obviously in Lebanon,
Yes.
I have a question about a word that you can find all across the Middle East, but particularly in the Levant. So Lebanon, obviously Syria and Palestine. So let's start talking about words.
Yes.
Which is Farangi or Franj. Obviously,
Yes.
this is a word that comes from a long time ago, but it's still very
Yes.
common in defining, let's say, non-Arabs in the region.
Yes.
Can you tell us something a little bit about the origin of the word?
Yes. Now, if I want to start about kind of like when we say the Firinj or the French, yes, they mean the foreigners, but there are layers of who the foreigners are. If I may explain. So initially in Arabic, there was a word that was called al-ajam, right? Al-ajam, in its initial meaning, it meant people who are unable to speak, or mutes, let's say. And that was applied to anyone who doesn't speak Arabic initially. But then in the Mashriq, in the Eastern Mediterranean side of things, it applied mostly to the Persian people, right? But even though in the time of the Andalus, it also applied there. But in our side of the world, Ajam, the connotation is that these are the Persian people, right? So that's the first layer. But then there was the contact with the Byzantines. So these were called Ar-Rum. So there's the first layer of non-Arab, Al-Furus, and then there's Ar-Rum. And people think it's kind of like Ar-Rum sounds like Roman or Roman. But the idea is because Constantinople was the Eastern Roman Empire, so that became Ar-Rum. You might have known, like even to this day in Lebanon, someone who's Greek Catholic or Greek Orthodox would be Rum Orthodox or Rum Catholic. That's what we call it. And then during Al-Ajam, Rome, then after that, during the Crusades, when it was the Francia, the Frankish kingdom or empire, that name became as in initially someone who is a crusader, the European, someone from there, but then eventually it came to mean any person who is from Europe, but not Greek. And to this day, it's been what, 1,500 years? No, not that much, 13 or something like that. To this day, we still use words that have the word Frange in it. For example, I myself would call a baguette khibz Frange. That means Frankish bread, that it came from there. The toilet, sorry for mentioning it, but it's called, like the toilet itself, it's called the hammam franji. It's kind of like the toilet that is franji, because the opposite of that would be hammam arabi, where it is shaped like a hole in the ground, like how a Japanese toilet might be, that kind of thing, And that word, it has a bit of sensitivities when used in other contexts too. We even have a proverb that says "Kil shi franji branji," which is said sarcastically in that everything that is foreign, like Frankish, but from European, it's as if it's anything, it's better than anything that is local. It's not meant seriously. You say it in sarcastically. And you had mentioned Turkish, like kilshi franje branje. So branje is a word adopted from Turkish, which is, it comes from birinci, which in Turkish now it means first, but the way the connotation is, it means best in the way we use it. Wait, talking about franje, one more word, which is interesting, like the lettuce, right? The romaine lettuce. So romaine lettuce, even the word romaine, because it probably from Rome, so for us, that's khas frangi.
I guess so everything's frangi at some point.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. It's kind of like we have the furus, the ajam, we have the room, and then we have the frangi. So,
but to keep this conversation also fun, I just want to say that in Italy, for instance, the toilet that you mentioned, the one with the hole on the ground, is actually called la turca, meaning the Turks. So we can see how words travel and change. Not meaning, because obviously the meaning is the same. Is that, I suppose, someone in Italy probably traveled through the Ottoman Empire. So we can speculate the Venetians or the Genoese. And when they saw that, they probably brought it back. And I must tell you that for a very long time, probably up until the 80s or 90s, most of the public toilets in Italy were alla turca, because we're considered more hygienic in a sense that you could clean them easier. They changed that, but absolutely very common. You would drive throughout Italy and stop in what we call autogrill, so service stations, and obviously the restroom would have la turca. So absolutely. Again, you see how these words change.
Yeah, and it's important to notice here is that whenever we adopt something, a word, be it food or a type of building, it's rarely that we take the name of the actual origin, but the name from the last person who we got it from. It's kind of like, how in Arabic we call the orange Portugal after Portugal, just because we got it from them, even though the Portuguese got it from China, the sweet orange. So it always happens like that. Or the million names of the turkey bird in different languages.
And you have a very good reel about the origin of the turkey, which is a fascinating crisscrossing of continents and names and people. Because you just mentioned Portugal, for instance, in dialects in the south of Italy, particularly around Naples, the orange is called Portugal. I mean, it's, again, all of these influences, which is interesting and fascinating given the current political era and age of appropriation and, claims that certain names are originally from one place, they never change, and they've always been, there and belong to a specific group of people. Well, the reality is that everything moves, change, is reshaped, redefined, and nothing is really static.
Yes.
Let me move to ask about Jerusalem.
Yes.
Because obviously this is a very controversial topic, and yet more, I guess in time, people began to accept the fact that when we talk about Jerusalem, there are different names, and each name represents different communities. Now, again, there are issues about particularly the Hebrew name, Yerushalayim, which has always been defined as the city of peace. Now, more and more scholars agree that it's nothing to do really with shalom, peace, but it's something different. But then, of course, we also have a Latin name, which anglicizes Jerusalem, the Arabic name, Al-Quds. We also had, for a long time, the Roman name, Aelia Capitolina. In fact, the early Arabs, when conquering Jerusalem, they called Ilia. The very name Jerusalem, or again, Yerushalayim, was Arabized for some time. I remember bumping into a document calling it Urshalim. So obviously, we talk about a city, but we also talk about many different names. And so I was wondering if we can start this conversation about the names of Jerusalem.
Well, okay. As you said, it is a controversial subject, right? So, but talking about the different names, I want to draw something on a bit of a, I don't want to call it a paradox, but a duality among Christians in the Middle East. On what point? So the city in Arabic, it's called Al-Idis, or Al-Quds in the colloquial, we say Al-Idis. However, when it comes to the church sayings and how it's said in church or in songs, it's always Urashalim, because it feels anachronistic to change these names and make them al-Idis. So, for example, in Easter, there's a hymn that's called Turuqa Urushalim, the Roads of Jerusalem. That's kind of famous. But it's a very clear delineation is that in that Urushalim is the Jerusalem back from when Jesus was there. And then Idis is the current meaning, current word. And because it has this political weight, the word, because like you don't want to say Urushalim because like it feels like you're betraying the cause, and it's not the correct name in Arabic. Even though, as you said, even among Arabs in early Islam, they did use Urushalim at some point. What's his name? That name of the poet, Al-Ashar. I think Al-Ashar. I forgot his name now. His name because he had blurry vision at night, so he used to use Urushalim. Or Mru'ul Qais. He's one of the famous pre-Islamic poets, right? So he used he used Al-Quds. Well, he didn't use Al-Quds. He referred to a priest from there as Maqdisi, which is kind of like the name that it implies that it predates Islam, at least. Not Idis, but at least maybe Bayt al-Maqdis or Al-Bayt al-Muqaddas, something like that. But also, as you mentioned, Ilia Capitolina, it was in Arabic for a long time. Even the coins from the Umayyad that had Ilia. Or Al-Farazdaq, like he was one of the most famous poets in the, I'd say, 8th century. He's a famous, so he has a big line that says, Baytullahi nahnu wulatuhu wa baytum bi'ala Ilia musharrifu. So it was a very common name. So it wasn't until the 9th century really that Al-Quds became kind of like the name instead of Bayt al-Maqdis or Al-Bayt al-Muqaddas or Ilia or something like that. So the idea is that in early centuries, I guess the people there, due to the absence of such, I don't want to say an absence of such charged political context because they had wars back then, but the idea of having multiple names was accepted. Now it's kind of like there's a line in the sand. Are you a Jerusalem person or Al-Quds person? I mean, that's how it is.
Let me ask a question about the sort of let's say the first name of Jerusalem, which is probably coming from Aramaic or Jebusite name. So this idea of Urshalim, and Ur obviously is a common term to define cities. I mean, even nowadays, certainly defines cities. So I was wondering, what's your take on the idea that maybe the city of peace or maybe the city of a goddess?
Look, how to say it? My opinion on that is that of someone who is not an expert on the time period back then. But I have read that there are records from the ancient Egyptian period where the name is cognate with Urushalim. It does, to me, it feels like it's the name of the it's kind of like the goddess, but I can't really say, like I'm not a scholar on the subject. However, I can tell you that in Aramaic, the word Orishlim, we still use that in the churches where the liturgical language is Aramaic. So we say Orishlim Dalai. So that name is still used.
I'm curious about something. You have obviously Lebanese roots, and I never had the chance to ask someone that actually is from Lebanon to ask about how do you see Jerusalem from just across the border? What does Jerusalem mean for Lebanese? Whether Christians, and obviously if you may know also about Muslims, whether they may be Shia or Sunni and other communities.
Yeah. Of course, the answer will differ a lot by religion. If we're talking religiously, not politically speaking. So what does it mean religiously, right? So to me, it's kind of like we said, yes, it's across the border. And I know it's a city that my father visited because it was pre-1967. But after that, for us, like we can't go there. I mean, technically I can if I get what do you call it, like a pilgrimage permit in Lebanon, but it feels like too risky. And it's like, what's the point to me? It's kind of like that kind of thing, you know? And it feels like it's a very important city, but religiously speaking, me personally, I don't feel that it's kind of like, how to say, the location, the stones, something like that, have as much significance as they might be for people who are more religious, let's say, right? But for someone who is Muslim, for example, that Dome of the Rock, of course, it has a lot of meanings for them there. I would love to visit one day, maybe, hopefully, but the most important part for me is not the religious part. It's not even the political part. It's the human part. As in, it feels like there's a lot of injustice going on there in how the Jerusalemites, who are Palestinians, are being driven out bit by bit from the city. So that's just, I want to say, not acceptable, but who's doing anything?
Well, as we record this episode, we saw fascinating events occurring in Israel just a few days ago, which were mostly occurring because of internal issues, but obviously they are deeply connected with the Palestinians and the question of the occupations and obviously the eradication of Palestinian identity, particularly in East Jerusalem. So we understand very well what you were just saying. But you mentioned something very interesting, and let me pick it up from there. So you said, inshallah, one day you'll be able to visit.
Yes.
And you'll be able to visit, you'll be able to go around the old city of Jerusalem, and you may end up trying to eat some of the local delicacies.
Oh, geez.
Going back to words. Obviously, Jerusalemites are very proud of their food, and there are some that obviously may also trigger debates between Jerusalemites and Palestinians of other cities. So let's start from the dessert, and maybe I'm going to ask you a few other things about other food. What about Knafeh? Do you have any idea about the origin of the word? And also, I'm curious about the Knafeh, and I know that you pronounce it also differently in Lebanon, of the Lebanese version.
Yes. So, yeah, we call it Knafeh. There's a specific thing in the Lebanese dialect that's distinguished, and parts of Syria too. It's called imala in Arabic, where a lot of the a become e. So Knafeh, for us, it's Knafeh, right? So here I want to say in that for a lot of our foods, be it Knafeh, be it falafel, be it tabbouleh, if the etymologies of these words were clear, then everybody would know about them, right? If they are documented. For now, there are theories. That's about it. Because the idea is that etymology as a science in Arabic has been, I don't want to say non-existent, but it's not something like you cannot easily find an etymology dictionary for Arabic as you can for English or French. Oddly enough, I want to say sadly enough maybe, but the first etymological project documenting the Arabic words is from the University of Oslo in Norway. It's the what do you call it? The Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages in Oslo. That's who they're working on the etymology project. So for now, you can find a few things, but I can say for Knafeh, there are some theories on that. But one theory on the Arabic origin is the root kanafa or ktanafa, or to sit by something, but it does not really make a lot of sense, so it's kind of like there's a lot of theories on there. And I want to say that for us and for the Palestinians, Knafeh means the dessert, but in other Arab countries, it does not mean just the dessert. It means that shredded dough on its own, it's called a Knafeh even before it becomes a dessert. Like you could see someone in Egypt saying frying chicken in Knafeh. They don't mean a dessert. That means that shredded pastry, which Turkish people might call kadayif, which for us is a different dessert. It's like it's a mess on these things. So there are theories. We don't know where they came from. We don't know the exact origin, and we don't know the exact origin of the words. Unfortunately, sorry to disappoint.
Well, so let me ask a big question: cheese or no cheese?
Uh, what do you mean no cheese? Is that an option? No, of course with
Well,
cheese.
as far as I know, the Egyptians, there is a recipe with no cheese. So I guess could be a good a good debate, right? A round table.
Well, for us, there are two versions in Lebanon, right? The most popular one is cheese. The less popular one is with ashta, which is kind of like the clotted cream thing. They're both good, but to me, the cheese is better. And of course, as I mentioned, like the nabulsiye from Nablus, the Palestinian one, it's with that kind of dough. For us, it's a completely different one. It's from semolina, and we do have a version of the Nabulsi Knafeh, which but on a smaller scale. And oddly enough, we call it Athmaliye, meaning Ottoman. Yeah.
There is a cultural battle, and a serious one, to be honest, which also has seen a number of scholars writing first PhDs and then books about falafel.
Mm-hmm.
I know this is a big one. Again, you go wander around the old city of Jerusalem, particularly in the let's call it now the Muslim quarter. Also, we know that in the past was much more mixed than it is nowadays. There are still a couple of old men selling fresh falafel, which is just amazing. It's very heavy but filling and very tasty, and yet it's a contested dish. And I was wondering if you have any information about not who owns falafel, but very much also about the origin of the word. Where is falafel from, for instance?
Well, the kind of like the main origin now, I don't want to say it's accepted, but it's that it's a Coptic word, or it's Coptic multiple words, means plenty or something like that. And if that was the truth, I would be very happy. Why? Because as part of my job in a previous job, I had to tour a lot of Arab countries, right? So I had falafel in, I don't know, maybe 15, 16 countries from the Arab world. And I became kind of a connoisseur on that. And I can say that, to me, hands down, no one beats Egyptian falafel. And this is from someone from Lebanon. So if the origin is Coptic, then yeah, they deserve that. They're the masters.
I'm sure that most of the Palestinian listeners of our podcast may have
I'm sorry
about it. But true also of the Israelis, which again is part of this cultural battle, which in time I understood, there is a bit of appropriation, obviously, which is true,
Yes.
given that most of Ashkenazi Jews made falafel some sort of an Israeli dish. But it's also true that there are almost the majority of Arab Jews from different parts of the Middle East that brought, again, different version of falafel into then the state of Israel after 48. And so it's interesting how you also see this kind of diversity, particularly among the different communities. And
Yes.
so this has become a long story, and one that obviously has no final or end in sight. Let me ask you a few questions. You traveled a lot around the Middle East, and I'm curious about perhaps few other stories about food. Food is very important to define identities. As I said earlier, Jerusalemites are very proud of, and again, it goes across communities. There are dishes that defines the Jewish communities, the Muslims and Christians in different ways, obviously. And I was wondering if you can share with us a few other interesting stories about specific food that defines the region.
Well, I wouldn't know if it's something that defined the region, but one food that is something that I love is the msa'a, which became a Greek food that's called the moussaka. And like, I have to be careful when we're talking about Greek foods and Greek words.
Yes, careful, because when you talk about moussaka, then you jump into the idea of lasagna, and you have an Italian in front of you.
Yeah, yes, but what I mean is moussaka is not a Greek word. Moussaka is a transliteration of msa'a, which means cold. And it's interesting that, again, with Egypt, like, they do it really, really well. But the difference is it's called msa'a, but they eat it hot. And it's kind of like, for us, it's kind of like we eat msa'a, but msa'a. But about the foods that kind of like define the region, it's a little bit sad to me. It's kind of like, on the evolution of food habits, there's not a lot documenting the area for how it is for us. So, for example, a lot of our foods in Mount Lebanon, in the mountains, are stews, regular stews, right? But these stews would always be eaten on now, these days, with rice on the side. But in the up to the 19th, 18th centuries, around that time, rice was considered rich people's food. It was never considered like the poor people food. That's why we ate everything with bulgur. So that's why it's kind of like bulgur. And you might know kibbe. So the base of it is bulgur. Even during Lent, which is right now, there's a type of kibbe called kibbe hili, or trickery kibbe, which is made by replacing all the meat with just a little bit of flour and birghul. So birghul is kind of like one of the key aspects of our food. And it'd be interesting to know how it disappeared a little bit as a staple of being eaten next to the stews and being replaced by rice. So I wouldn't call that a very fascinating story about the foods in the Middle East, but I would love to see an anthropological and historical culinary book documenting how food evolved in the Middle East, because there's not a lot of sources on that.
No, it's true. There's not a lot of sources. Now you mentioned kubbe or kibbe, for instance. I know that in what now we call Galilee, or the northern part of the West Bank, obviously kibbe is very common. But again, also there is this continuity and contiguity with Lebanon, which we should remind it was part of the Ottoman Empire for centuries. And again, people didn't have to cross borders other than administrative ones. So food could have been, just shared among communities without the necessity of a passport. And so it was easier even for these kind of cultural elements to move around. I'm curious about a few other words that, obviously originate in Arabic and had very important repercussions in the West, but also with Christians in the Middle East. When we think about alcohol, we have to remember this is an Arab word. And while Muslims may not drink alcohol, they can produce alcohol. And
yes.
Alcohol is very popular from Palestine, Lebanon, obviously in Turkey, under the name of rakah in Turkish, or arrak in Arabic. And I was wondering, if you have perhaps anecdotes about the origins of the name and also the alcohol itself.
Well, just about origins of names, because that came to mind now. A concept in linguistics, which is called reborrowing, where a word starts from your language and then it goes away and it comes back to you in a completely different form. So, for example, the artichoke, right? So the artichoke, the origin of that name, how it came to be, is from Andalusian Arabic, al-kharshuf. And a single piece of artichoke is al-kharshufa. It turned into Middle Spanish as alcarchofa, but then it went all around to Italy and it became artichoco. And then it went to the Levant, to us, and then through false etymology, we took artichoco and we made it ardi shauki. And ardi means of the ground, and shauki means thorny. So it's kind of like a word that went from us, went away, and that came back to us in a completely different form. Al-kharshufa became ardi shauki. So I love like how these words travel, kind of like, and another one, well, that didn't start in Arabic. That was just because it was something I was talking about yesterday, which is the word Levant. It's kind of like Levant, and someone from the Levant is Levantino, who came from Venice through the Albanian sailors who obviously spoke Albanians and didn't, the people in the Levant, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, didn't understand what they were saying. So that word became as a euphemism for something that you don't understand. It's like, are you speaking Lawandi, which is the Arabized word of Levendi. So it's kind of like, we are Levantines, and we are saying the word Lawandi to mean something that is completely incomprehensible.
Which paradoxically, you may say in English, is gibberish, which comes from Arabic, jabari. I mean, it's like the fact that they couldn't understand him. So was that gibberish? So it's fascinating how language is.
Yes. And another word that you might think of, it's kind of like for people who understand Spanish or Portuguese, the word ojalá or oxalá in Portuguese, it's kind of like that came from la sha Allah, which is kind of like the other version of inshallah, and it became to them, it's kind of like hopefully or something like that. So So it's just fascinating the way, like words are like gifts, to be honest. It's kind of like gifts, as in if they cross to another language. I don't like to think of these things as appropriation, in that whenever you don't have something as intentional, it's kind of like, no, I'm not stealing your word. It's kind of like, it's just through contact, and the word traveled, and it might come back to you. You start with al-kharshufa and you come back with ardishauke. This is beautiful.
We were digressing now. I remember I asked you something about alcohol, and also I remember that, for instance, there are speculation about the origin of the word in English booze, as in Istanbul, I'd say throughout the Ottoman Empire, often Christians selling alcohol, they basically own these shops that were called booza. So perhaps there's also a connection there. But yes. I was wondering if you know anything about, again, this famous drink, raki.
Well, I mean, how to say, for us in Arabic, we call it arrak, right? And arrak and raki and raka, they sound similar. But it's kind of like, are they from the same root, let's say, or did one? Because if you look at the Arabic origins, as per the people who like to do the distillery thing, the idea is that you have the karake. I forgot what the name of the thing in English is. That thing where you boil the grapes with the aniseed and it goes up, right? And because of the sweat that you have on the copper, because it used to be copper, so the sweat in Arabic is araq. So the drink name araq is the same word as the sweat. But is that related to raka? I honestly don't. What I mean is that, is it related, as in, is it documented? Is it not false etymology or folk etymology? Because we always have to be careful when it comes to these Arabic, because there's a lot of theories, and you don't want to, you want to just be sure what you're talking about.
I have one last question. Is
Sure.
there any word or idea that while you were researching for your reels stood up and you feel like, wow, I didn't know this, and kind of shocked you?
Yes, Afandi. Afandi, because that word, we use that to mean, how to say, so it came from the Ottomans, right? So Afandi, which means someone who has a certain rank, right? And now we use it sarcastically in Lebanon. So you call us like Shubeki Afandi. That's like, who do you think you are? Something important. But in Egypt, for example, it still has retained this respectful meaning. So like Afendim. And then it turned out that the word came from Authentikos, which is Byzantine Greek, but it came from ancient Greek, as in Authentikos. And it's the same root for someone who is authentic. So that word Afendi from authentic. It also, another word that I like, because it's always that interconnection between ancient Greek and Ottoman, Turkish, and then in Arabic, which is the word for parsley. So the word for parsley in ancient Greek was Makedonesi, I forgot, Petrosilium. Makedonesi Petrosilium, which means rock celery from Macedonia, right? So this Makedonisi, which now it's Makedonisi in modern Greek, turned into Arabic as Baqdunis, which is the same word that we use when we say Maqduni, as in someone from Macedonia. So it turned out that Baqdunis is the same thing as Al-Iskandar al-Maqduni, Alexander of Macedonia. So to me, that's like, that blew my mind so, I mean, you have to be a word nerd to be impressed by something like that. But to me, that was like, oh my God, that's so awesome. So.
This was Fadi Boukaram. You can find him on all social media under the nickname Sidras K, and I will post the full link on the podcast note. It was a fun conversation. We learned a lot about interesting words. Fadi, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much for having me. It was great.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to support the podcast, please share it with others on social media or leave a rating and review. To catch all the latest, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. at Jerusalem Unplugged. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.